This lecture covers the new February public forum topic from the NSDA on urbanization in West Africa. The resolution is resolved on balance, the benefits of urbanization in West Africa outweigh the harms. There are three key terms in this resolution: urbanization, West Africa, and on balance combined with outweigh. Let's start with urbanization. Urbanization generally means people moving into cities. We can say permanently concentrated in a relatively small area, forming cities. That's what urbanization means. So you have these people who are kind of spread out all across Africa. You see this in other continents as well. And they all start moving into these cities. That's called urbanization, and that's the most common definition of what urbanization means. Now, urbanization can also mean the process of making an area more urban. Now, what does that mean, right? So it would probably, it does include moving the people, but also building the infrastructure, building the buildings, those types of things, building the telecommunication systems, building the financial infrastructure. And I think one pro trick on this topic will be to include that definition of strengthening the cities where people are moving to so that they can be better and more well functioning. Now, obviously, the pro can't argue a plan to do that, but they could say that that process of strengthening those cities is desirable to get at the negative arguments, and I'll explain that a little bit more later, but I just want to explain that that idea comes from the definition of urbanization itself. Now, West Africa. West Africa or Western Africa is the westernmost region of Africa. So you can see Africa there, and you can see the 16 countries that it includes right there in the green. So that's the area we're talking about. You can certainly read evidence, and we'll talk about this urbanization, good, bad, general evidence. It's about all of Africa or even, outside of other areas because these same types of arguments apply. But the resolution is specific to the debate about West Africa, and we'll talk about how that plays out. And we can see that the general statistics show that there's going to be a lot of population growth within West Africa and continued urbanization. And here on this slide, you can see, right, the red being the urban areas, you can see how it's grown. Not just kind of like, the beginning here, we can see how much urbanization has increased, all right, since 1950 to 2015 in Africa generally, the red areas being the cities. But then you can look at West Africa. There's a couple different maps. On the right-hand side, it shows 1990 to 2020. We've gone from 2,500 cities to 6,000 cities. So slightly more than doubling. And then on the left-hand side, you can see where that urbanization has largely occurred. It's largely occurred like in the coastal regions and kind of a bit on the eastern side of West Africa. Now, West Africa is not just a term. You could see back there in that Wikipedia definition, it does list 16 specific countries, and it's a United Nations designation, official United Nations designation of what West Africa is. And here on this side, you can see that the UN breaks Africa down into these 5 subregions, right? So you see West Africa in the red, you can see North Africa in the gold, you could see Central Africa in the purple, you can see East Africa in the green, and you can see Southern Africa where there's been a lot of urbanization in the blue. And it does vary a bit by region. You can see these maps, again, 1950, right, all the way through. This one goes up to 2010. You can see the various amount of urbanization that's taken place, all right, in Africa. In 1950, we can see it was really just in the north and the south. In 1970, it developed more in the north and the south, and then it started to spread in 1990 into more of Africa. And now you can see in 2010 that there is a lot of urbanization throughout Africa. But if you look in that like Western Africa area, you can see there is kind of a little bit less urbanization in that West Africa area, even though it's intended to grow, than there are in other parts of Africa. So again, we want to have this specific debate about West Africa. What are some things we can think about? Well, what's unique about West Africa's environment, right? There's a lot of, and we'll talk about the pro and con arguments. There's a lot of pro and con arguments about what's kind of, is urbanization good for the environment or bad for the environment? But what are there some specific things in West Africa's environment or areas within Western Africa where urbanization might be uniquely good or bad for the environment? The same thing for the economy. What's the current state generally of West Africa's economy? What's the employment picture? Teams that are able to kind of isolate impacts that are specific to West Africa are at least going to enjoy the rhetorical advantage of being able to say how our evidence, our arguments are specific to West Africa. Maybe the other team's arguments are just about urbanization generally anywhere in the world or urbanization in Africa. The more you can specify and talk about West Africa, the better off you are going to be. I mean, some of it's going to be a little artificial. In other words, meaning that like your evidence may just happen to reference West Africa, but the same argument probably does apply elsewhere. But generally speaking, the more you can put your arguments into kind of what's going on in West Africa, the better. Also, the other thing to think about is like, is it better or worse than other regions? And I'll talk more about this later and kind of throughout the discussion. But people do want to urbanize, right? Like just look globally, East Asia, the development of cities, the United States, the development of cities. People are drawn to cities, both for economic reasons and for personal reasons. So if this urbanization is kind of inevitable in Africa, if West Africa didn't urbanize, maybe more people would move into Southern Africa and urbanize. Maybe more people would go into Eastern Africa and urbanize. And maybe, it would be better if West Africa urbanized in those areas, or maybe it would be worse. Now, there are a few things to think about, a couple of which I've already touched on, that the literature, the first is that the literature has a lot of pros and cons of urbanization, but I don't really see people arguing for a reversal of urbanization, like going back to rural life. What they're generally saying, okay, urbanization has created some problems. What are the policy responses that we need to have? Like, how can we make these cities better? How can we strengthen the cities that we live in? So there are fewer environmental problems, so there are fewer problems with disease. So if you go back and you think of that second definition of urbanization I offered, which is like improving the urban areas, maybe that's what the pro really needs to be arguing for. And as I just mentioned, urbanization is kind of largely inevitable. So the question becomes, what can we do about it? Can we make it better? Right? Can you argue that urbanization is strengthening the infrastructure, not just the movement of people? Is it better or worse than other regions? And what are some specific, like in particular countries? Like maybe we need urbanization in one of the particular countries of Africa or West Africa. Maybe it's bad. So in a particular country. So the more I said again, like earlier, how you can get your arguments to be specifically about West Africa, the better. If you have examples or contentions from specific regions, that's going to strengthen your arguments even more. But those are some broader things to think about that as you construct your arguments and we talk about the pros and cons of urbanization, they may allow you to kind of take your arguments to the next level a little bit. But let's just talk about like what are some of the benefits of urbanization? Well, the first is kind of poverty reduction, right? Like whatever the limitations are of living in cities, it's really hard to survive when you're in a poor area like out in the countryside. It's hard to get goods, it's hard to get services, it's hard to generate income. As poor as people are in the cities, they generally kind of find themselves to be like a little bit better off than they do in the countryside. And then second of all, there are remittances. Remittances are money that you like send back to poor like relatives. So if you move, like you're an immigrant, you move to the United States, you have family in Mexico, you might work here and like send some money back. Similarly, people who move into urban areas, if they're able to generate some income, they can send that back to rural areas. And then of course we have poverty reduction that occurs through economic growth. Well, what are all the different reasons that cities like strengthen economic growth? Some are listed here. I'm sure you can find a lot more. The first is it's easier to get access to capital. Capital is just the money that you take and invest in a business or invest in something that you're doing. Even like, not maybe capital literally, but like, you need to borrow money to buy a house. You need to borrow money to get your business going. You need to get investors to support your business, your businesses to get it off the ground. That's all easier, and you have more access to it with banks and stuff like that in cities. It's also easier to sell goods, right? There's millions of people living in cities, millions of people like going by your storefront. You can also get access to business services like financial services, accounting services, marketing services for your business. You're also connected to a lot of people that maybe are also interested in investment in entrepreneurship. There's also higher productivity. In other words, like, okay, you're in a rural area, you might have to walk an hour, like they say, to go get some water. Well, here you just have water like right in your apartment or in your home. You can just turn it on. That allows you to spend more time on your work. There's also jobs that can be created through infrastructure development. We know we need to build things, just simple things like roads and subways and trains like within the cities to move people around. That can create jobs. And just generally the city dwellers are sitting there creating goods outside their little markets. They're sharing them. But these are just a lot of the different reasons that cities kind of tend to promote economic growth relative to rural areas. And you can talk about the benefits of economic growth in terms of overall societal development or even just poverty reduction. There's other literature that says urbanization reduces political conflict because you have ethnic and religious, cleavages. Obviously, in the world, there are a lot of ethnic, religious cleavages, even racial cleavages. They say when people kind of move towards the city, those things tend to get integrated into what we would call the melting pot, and it reduces cleavages, which could reduce conflict. And some people say it also supports a democratization, that there's more demand for political inclusion, that as people get money, as people start to participate in the economy, they want a stronger role in politics. They start participating in politics, which strengthens a political inclusion. There's also more goods are being produced. There's more goods to distribute. So there's less of kind of a tyrannical situation where somebody's trying to hoard all the goods to survive. There are also arguments about healthcare, and these healthcare arguments I think are really important because we're going to talk about a con argument about disease, which is really strong. So I think pro teams definitely want to talk about, even just for the only reason of getting a leg up on that debate, what about access to healthcare? We need access to more modern healthcare, right? We need access to doctors. We need advanced access to technology in hospitals that can treat diseases and other forms of ailments, which you're not going to find in rural areas. You need access to surgery, which you're not going to find in rural areas. And because it's produced at and accessible to more people, it just becomes a bit more affordable. As expensive as healthcare is, even in the developing world, it's still cheaper to provide it in the cities themselves. Then we also have kind of we might call digital transformation or smart cities. And there's a lot of literature starting to be written about this generally, just what a smart city is. But again, it goes to kind of that second definition of urbanization where you're arguing for strengthening the city itself. You could have fast internet that supports business development just generally in terms of communication between businesses, marketing. You can have internet product development. Now we have all these apps. We can deliver services like healthcare, legal services. We can have online trading and markets. There's even another thing I could have put there's environmental monitoring that can occur. Things that try to reduce traffic congestion. There's all types of things you can read about smart cities in the developing world and how urbanization, maybe technology, can be used to improve our overall lives. Now, obviously, there could be some disadvantages associated with that, such as privacy and things that we could talk about. But there are some things about the digital transformation of the cities. Now, there's also benefits to reducing environmental damage. And one of the con arguments is going to be about the environment. So again, I think this is something the pros should get a leg up on, that we want to take pressure off environmentally protected areas. So in rural areas, there are certain forests or grasslands or just areas that people really haven't inhabited. And we want to get we don't want people to continue to push into those areas. Look, that's where there are kind of a lot of animal diseases that humans haven't come in contact with that are environmentally sensitive. They may be some of the last environmentally protected areas of the world. We need to get them in. We also need to kind of strengthen renewable energy development. All right, and we need to kind of, there's more solar, wind power that's easier to have in cities, and then to build the more modern power grids to transfer that energy. So people also say reduce fertility, which just means people are having fewer children. That's more likely to occur as city development occurs. We could also talk about China, the role of China in West Africa. Again, this is a strong pro and strong con, but as the city's development in infrastructure is needed, one of the big countries that invests is China, because they do have a lot of capital. and they have an interest in expanding their ties in this area. So some people say it's good as we urbanize more, China becomes more involved. Obviously there's a debate between the East and the West, but some people say that China really has the best kind of development model. It mends the state and the market kind of together in a way that's productive. It's like state-driven kind of capitalist development as opposed to the U.S. model, which is more just kind of entirely capitalist and free market. So that's really kind of a blended model of development that China uses, and some people argue is effective. And there's another argument, I'm not really sure how exactly you want to articulate in the debate, but I think you can kind of say as the pro, like, hey, people in Africa have chosen to urbanize. Who are we to say, like, what's not good for them? That's a little bit more of like a critique argument that kind of doesn't make it into public forum debate so much, but I think it's a way you can kind of overall kind of assess like the pros and cons of these arguments and just say, look, there are a lot of benefits to urbanization and Africa should choose, and like, who are we really to criticize it? Problems with urbanization. Well, there are a lot of advantages to urbanization. There are also like a lot of disadvantages to urbanization. This is a good topic that way in terms of kind of the, having good arguments on both sides. So one big problem is that there's a lot of inequality. A lot of very poor people live in areas that are called, like, referred to as slums, where just, you have thousands, millions of people crowded into, apartments and kind of makeshift dwellings, all right, where there's a lot of inequality. You have concentrated young people. So obviously, as I said, right now, like the population growth is high. In that first slide, we showed it was going to double, which means there's going to be a lot of young people. And until that economy really develops, there's really not enough jobs, which can create all kinds of potential for instability, conflict, criminal activity when people are disaffected. So that is a big problem with urbanization. There's also, a lot of these cities that talked about the different ways they should be able to grow. But there has been a lack of growth in these cities. Why? Because they can't access the capital that's needed to develop. There isn't a lot of capital in these cities. There's obviously there's some Chinese involvement, but there's good evidence that basically it takes like trillions of dollars to develop these cities, and this capital is just not available, especially right now as the world deals with COVID and the decline, that there's a lot of corruption. What is corruption? It's like, well, when politicians are collecting monies, from like distributions that they shouldn't be able to access to, when business leaders are collecting these to make, contracts, when there's a lot of just stealing. So this lack of this corruption, kind of in a lack of a legal structure to come in and enforce against the corruption, can make it difficult for there to be a lot of growth. There's also just like a lot of traffic jams and poor like transportation. That just kind of makes it difficult to get around cities. If you've been even not just Africa, but any part of the developing world, and you go into a major city, you see there are huge like transportation bottlenecks that block growth. A third problem is disease, the spread of disease, and I think this will be a common argument now, especially since we're living in COVID. That argument is going to have a lot of salience to the judges. That people living in crowded areas, you have a lot of people in the cities. They're living in crowded areas, as I mentioned earlier, but there's also like poor infrastructure. Like there's poor water infrastructure. There's poor sanitation, right? There's poor like garbage disposal, right? So that, and then you have all these people living like closely together. That just makes it very easy for diseases to spread. There's also, as lifestyle improves a little bit in the cities, there's a greater demand for meat, which could push us externally, indirectly into the more farming in those rural areas, right? Offsetting what I talked about before. Increasing the risk of like animal viruses. And of course, then any infrastructure that does exist, you have the connections between the cities and the rural areas. So if you have a disease outbreak, could spread, say the disease happens, it gets exposed in the rural area, it spreads into the city, and then it like spreads all over the city, or even vice versa. So these transportation networks can actually increase the amount of disease spread. And as I said, I think this will be a popular argument because, judges will find it persuasive given the current COVID situation. We can have problems with the environment. There's obviously a lot of waste that's produced in concentrated areas. It gets dumped into rivers, streams, right? Human waste, just garbage waste, all kinds of problems there that cause a lot of pollution. Then, of course, you have energy production byproducts. Like you have climate change, right? More carbon dioxide, more air pollution, which, as I mentioned earlier, is like another reason like why the pro maybe wants to make like those renewable energy or smart cities with environment arguments to try to get at this, because it is a huge problem in these cities. Crime and terrorism, it's easy to recruit disaffected individuals, right, to join terrorist organizations or criminal syndicates. If people are unemployed, they don't really have much of a future, right? They can look to those opportunities to try to build it. They're also like, these cities really lack like kind of, there's some security infrastructure, right? But the police can easily be bribed. They're not that well professionally trained. There's really not enough of them. So it just kind of combines, right? You have situations that make a lot of criminal activity possible, and then you don't really have the security forces to kind of back it up. I talked about smart cities being good. There's arguments as to why smart cities are bad. Smart city, basically everything connected to the internet. You can have a lot of surveillance. You can have a lot of monitoring, movement of people. You can have violations of privacy. Some people say that can kind of lead to, more totalitarianism by the governments. Obviously, if the internet breaks down, then you can have lots of problems. Everything kind of depends on that. If your power grid and everything is like dependent on the internet, and you have some, cyber attacks or just general internet breakdowns, then you can have a lot of problems with that. So smart cities sound really cool and really awesome, but there are some disadvantages associated with them. You could talk about why China's involvement is bad. Like you said, talked about why their development model is good, all right, when we were talking about the pro, but you could also say that their development model is bad. Why? Well, China's development model, maybe it doesn't allow enough growth of the free market. Maybe we need a stronger free market. You can debate about that, right? I mean, obviously, Westerners, right, prefer a stronger, like, free market. We kind of claim that China is socialism or communism. So you could say that, a Western development model is better, but if the cities continue to urbanize, given, like, kind of Western retrenchment for financial reasons, for political reasons, that China's just going to get involved in that. It's going to be bad. China will exploit more of their resources. There's a big debate about China 5G technology, whether this allows China to collect more information to kind of control the internet. So those smart cities, you could argue, are going to end up using China's 5G technology, and that's going to be bad. And of course, there's kind of political instability associated really just kind of back from those problems of unemployment, people being young, these areas being difficult to govern, and kind of a lack of experience like within government itself to manage these problems. So this kind of highlights some of the major pros and cons of the topic. Now, again, let's go to pro tricks. Like I mentioned, all of these are good. I've mentioned all of these before, but you could say pro tricks. Well, one is, is West African urbanization better than urbanization elsewhere? So say, look, urbanization's inevitable. It's driven by kind of human desires. It's happening all over Africa. It's better to have it in Western Africa than maybe other regions which are already maybe more urbanized than they should be, all right, or have kind of unique kind of environmental situations, all right, or have different kind of slightly different economic structures. I'm just speculating that it's point to why West African urbanization is better. Again, more urbanization can take pressure off existing cities, right? So it's like, yes, urbanization is good because we already have it. It's a little tricky argument. I'm not sure how the judges will react to this, but to say, look, if we don't have continued urbanization, then the existing cities are just going to become larger and larger, and these problems are going to more manifest itself. So we need more urbanization to take pressure off the existing cities. Then we can just, our basic arguments, cities solve poverty, terrorism, environment, talk about smart cities and why they're good, and maybe continued urbanization supports that. And then, of course, just like as I say, arguing for making the cities stronger, right? Like urbanization, sure, it includes the movement of people, but if it includes strengthening the cities, then you say, yes, we need to have more urbanization. We need to have more infrastructure development in the cities. We need to have more sanitation in the cities. We need to have better renewable energy sources in the cities. We need to build like more apartments and like more homes so people aren't living in crowded areas. We need to develop it economically to reduce the slums, right? So I think if you can really focus on that second like manifestation of like what urbanization can be and argue that there are people already moving into these cities. We need to continue to urbanize and develop these cities to make them better. Con tricks. Well, again, the opposite, right? You can argue that West African urbanization is not as widespread yet. We can see that from the charts at the beginning of the lecture, and maybe there are some reasons that it's worse to urbanize West Africa. Like, and say, hey, it's not as urbanized, so they don't have like many environmental problems. Their economies haven't been as disrupted. There haven't been as many changes, right? Because even in West Africa, from that initial chart, most of that urbanization was in kind of like that kind of southern part of West Africa and the southeast part of West Africa. Why do we need to go urbanize the whole thing now? And then, of course, I think you should add some country and specific arguments. I think that will help you. Now, on weighing, you want to say, look, you could get in a debate absent kind of some of these different tricks and ideas I've discussed. You could get into these areas, well, which outweighs? Maybe the pros winning that they reduce poverty and development, but the cons winning the environment argument. So how is the pro going to weigh these poverty and development arguments against the crime arguments? Maybe the con is winning that, urbanization spreads disease, but the pros winning that, urbanization improves renewable energy access and access to other forms of environmental technology. Like, how do you weigh these two and compare them? So you can think of those main areas, right? Poverty, development, environment, security, health, and how would you weigh on each side, one against the other, if you were winning one and your opponent was winning the other? I think a lot of the summaries and final focus speeches will come down to this weighing. Second, like, how do the issues intersect, right? Like, if we improve development, will that help or hurt the environment, right? If we improve development, will that reduce the security problems? All right. If there are disease problems, will that undermine development? We can see as COVID spreads, now it's having a very deleterious impact on the developing world, poverty. Like, how does that work, right? So does one intersect the other? So in addition to weighing, what you really need to do is compare, of course, the impacts and the issues, but also discuss how one affects the other. And then what role do the tricks play in weighing? What do I mean by the tricks? Of course, urbanization is inevitable. We need to just strengthen the urbanization in terms of the movement of people is inevitable. So we need to we need to continue to let urbanization happen to strengthen the cities. All right, is it better or worse in West Africa? Those could kind of short circuit a little bit, that general weighing and those general arguments. But those are important things to think about. Now, a few concluding thoughts. The first is offer detailed reasons for your main ideas. What do I mean by that? Well, as I talked about, like in the discussion of the economy and economic development, there's a lot of different reasons that urbanization could strengthen the economy. You should have a lot of those reasons in your speech. Not only is it kind of more generally persuasive to the judge to be able to explain all of those details, but then look, the reality of it is if they don't answer like a couple of those reasons in the rebuttal, you can always talk about that. So on each of these issues, there are a lot of reasons. There are even more reasons. I did touch on a lot of them in the lecture to give you some examples, but you should have some detailed reasons. Second, it's a topic that has a lot of stats and quantification. I think PF's gone a little bit overboard on the stats because, different stats are going to apply in different situations, right? But there's going to be a lot of evidence that, from a study, it says, well, we studied this region and in this city, like urbanization, increased economic growth by 2% or increased pollution by like 4% or reduced mortality, like the death rate by like X%. Like I say, I think PF is a little obsessed with stats. It's kind of like the policy debater's nuclear war. It kind of assumes you can quantify things in ways that you can't, or that somebody's making a really definitive conclusion about exactly what the quantification is. But nonetheless, lay judges, especially in public forum, find very stats and quantification like very important. And this is a topic where you're going to be able to find that. So when you're doing research, finding quotes, finding references, if you paraphrase, then make sure you're including those stats because they're really present in literature. And then third, weighing and the tricks are critical. There really are a lot of pros and cons to urbanization. There are a lot of strong arguments on both sides. So you'll obviously have rebuttals and you'll rebut like what the other side is saying, but you're only going to be able to do so much. I think in the end, the pro will win one or two reasons that urbanization is good, the con will win or one or two reasons that urbanization is bad, and you're really going to have to weigh. Weighing's always important in debate, but on this topic, like I say, there just are a lot of good pro and con arguments, and then think about how the tricks impact that. So, okay, it's just kind of meant to be just a general introductory lecture to the topic, but I do wish you the best of luck on the resolution with your preparations, and check back in for more material as we have it. Thank you.